All right. And could you give me share rights?
What I'm doing right now.
Right. By the time we're done with these, we'll get these things flying.
Right? By the time everyone's elected, we'll have Zoom down. Because we haven't had years of it.
Exactly. So, all right. All right. Well, welcome everyone. Oh, there we go. All right. Are we sharing just one screen, or are we sharing two here?
I see one screen.
Perfect. Okay. Well, thanks everybody for joining us. We're very happy to announce one of our mayoral candidates, Alyia Gaskins, who is no stranger. We've had a number of sessions with her around town, and especially with zoning for housing. But we're going to focus on the mayoral campaign here as we go through. So just some basic housekeeping that'll be familiar for everybody who's done this before. So we'll kick off. We'll let Alyia talk a little bit about herself in her own words. I'll kick off with a starter question, and then as we're going through, we'll do a Q&A until about 8:20, and then we'll take the last question, then turn it over to Alyia to close out with any statements, anything she wants to reinforce, and then we'll adjourn promptly at 8:30 so everybody can get on with their evenings. Just some ground rules, just in order to facilitate this moving forward. Just either use the raise hand feature, or you can just kind of wave at the camera, whatever works best for you. And we'll do our best to keep track and call people in the order in which they've received. Feel free to ask clarifying questions if the question doesn't answer, or the answer doesn't actually address your question, or you've got some follow-up. Please keep it kind of on task. If you've got another question, wait so that everybody has an opportunity. As we go through here, the only thing that we ask is just that we be respectful of one another. One of the things that we really pride ourselves on is not devolving into the online vitriol. So disagreements completely fine. Just make sure that we keep everything respectful here. And then if you break any of these rules, we'll kick you out. But so far we haven't had that. They've been great sessions, so we're looking forward to it. So with that, I will go ahead and stop sharing. We're not heavy on slides here, since at least that's what I do all day. But so Alyia, we'll turn it over to you. Like I said, just whatever you'd like to kind of introduce yourselves, and then we'll just jump into some questions from there. And like I said, I think Chris has got a couple that came into her via kind of her role in land use, and we'll go from there.
All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Nate and Karen, thank you so much for organizing our conversation tonight. It's really a joy to be with you. For those of you who don't know my story, I was raised by a single mom. My mom worked 2, sometimes 3 jobs. And the reality is we often struggled to make ends meet. And it's interesting, when I was looking at the picture of your logo, it reminded me of the porch that my home used to have. And my earliest memories were often our neighbors leaving Tupperware filled with dinner or clothes or other things outside for us because they knew we needed it. It wasn't because, we asked for it. It wasn't because somebody told them they had to. It was because that's what neighbors do. Neighbors look out for neighbors. And it's through those experiences that I learned really quickly that if you see someone in need, you help them. And if you see a problem, you fix it. And so the reason why I ran for city council in the first place is because, like you, as much as I love our community, I know there are things we can do better. I know there are problems that need fixing, and I wanted to be a part of that solution. And so on the council, I've really worked to use my time to not just take up space, but to make sure that I am responding to residents and moving forward policies and programs that are of interest to our community. I led the charge to start our city's first youth safety and resilience effort, in which now we have young people coming to the council and telling us what they need to feel safe and valued in our community. I led the charge to help secure body-worn cameras for our police officers. It was appalling to me that they'd been asking for this for over a decade, yet we're still not getting the resources they needed to be able to fully serve us. I also led the charge to expand senior tax relief as well as 2 new senior outreach positions, and then have worked with my colleagues to create a new Office of Climate Action. And that's just a few of the things I'll share tonight, but there are many more things that I've worked on on, from housing to infrastructure to transportation, because as you know, they are all critical to the quality of life that we enjoy and that we deserve. And so I'm running for mayor because I believe that the challenges that remain can only become opportunities with the right leadership. And I'm committed to helping us be a safer, more safer community, a more affordable community, and one that is more accessible. And by accessible, I mean one where people truly feel they are shaping and a part of the decisions and really a part of making our government work. I guess I would just close with two things. One, I believe that my background in public health, urban planning, and my certificate in municipal finance has helped me understand these issues, both the technical side, but the very human experiences we go through every day, and will help me and help us as a city plan more holistically and really get at the root causes of the issues we face. And finally, I think what has most prepared me for this position, and I think distinguishes me from my opponents, is the record I've built as somebody who's responsive, as someone who takes what she hears and tries to figure out how we broker or compromise or how we incorporate those new ideas, and as somebody who really has worked to build diverse coalitions, of people who have just moved here, of people who've lived here a really long time, of young people, of seniors, of people who need help, and of those who have helped to give. And I look forward to building upon that reputation and that record of results, while also bringing some new energy and new leadership to the position. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions. Oh, you're muted.
It wouldn't be a Zoom meeting without it, right? So I'm going to start off with something. I know we've got some kind of questions around how zoning for housing and some of those things have affected the neighborhood specifically. But a question that you and I have talked a little bit about in the past is looking at workforce housing and preservation of affordability. And I don't mean, committed affordable or anything like that, just general, market rate houses. We've talked Glendale Avenue apartments. We've talked about what used to be the Avenue Flats above Chief Teak and Peace Out here on Mount Vernon. So one of the things I haven't heard anybody talk about is they're talking about any of the policies that will help make things affordable. We've talked about subsidies. We've talked about increasing supply, but we haven't talked about ways that we can limit predatory purchasing and the effect of short-term rentals. So the example that I'll use is CASA, which is a nationwide company. I think they've got like 70 buildings that they use. They operate two sets of Airbnbs in Delray. Mm-hmm. Delray Tower, the other is above Peace Out. It used to be the Avenue of Flats, which was workforce housing. Those used to go for like right around 1,000, maybe a little bit more before they were kicked out. Some people that Dana Lawhorn used to live there, a number of other folks. Those are now renting as Airbnbs for about $4,100 a month. So that's a significant chunk of the housing supply. One of the things I brought up to council when we had the final zoning for housing was you could unlock more supply just by getting rid of Airbnbs than you could by any of the processes that you're currently working through without really disturbing any of the neighborhoods. So can you talk a little bit about either why council is not approaching that side of things, given that is corporate interest buying properties rather than looking at ways that we can, change the nature of neighborhoods through additional development?
Yeah. So I'll take your question in two parts. The first, because you started to talk about preservation, and I have been saying this, I've been banging the drum on this. We do not talk about preservation enough. And I can tell you, when I was getting my master's in urban planning, we always talked about the 3 Ps of the housing stool. There's production, there's protection, and there's preservation. And I think we talk a lot in this community about production, which is important. We know new units are critical. But if we don't preserve what we already have, we're never going to keep up. You're going to be building and losing, and you're never going to reach what we need to do to actually solve the problem. So from a larger preservation strategy, something I have talked about is I want to, on like day 1 or month 1, start our city's preservation task force. I think you guys all know I live on the West End. There's a lot of old apartment stock out here that any predatory landlord can come in, flip it, or not even flip it, put in, maybe some nice hardwood or some fake granite, and all of a sudden raise the rent by 500%. So I'd really like us to have a task force that is focused on on what are the strategies we need to keep those places affordable. I know DC has done some programs where, the city will maybe cover the cost of a large maintenance project, maybe an elevator or an HVAC system. And then as a result, they're able to then do an agreement with the property owner to keep it affordable. We haven't really explored tools like that, and I think there's a real opportunity. So I'll pause on that. On the Airbnb side, I agree with you that we have not regulated this industry in our community the way that we should. And so since February, myself and Councilmember Kanika Giri have been working with our planning and zoning staff to get them to do research on what are all of the ways other jurisdictions regulate Airbnbs and what are the authorities we have available to us that we have not taken advantage of. It's my understanding there's over, like when you look across Arlington, Fairfax, Prince William, there's almost like 14 or 15 different things we could be doing, and we do none of those. Something as simple as even registering them. Like right now, it's pretty much a voluntary process, and then we have to go track you down later. So there's no enforcement when you violate our other ordinances. To the other pieces you mentioned about just even the stock that people are going after, we have not put those tools in place. So I'm committed to introducing additional regulation of Airbnbs and trying to slow the growth of those. My understanding, knock on wood, is that a proposal is supposed to come to us before our June recess. So one of the things I tell people in these sessions is I'm on council now. I'm happy to follow up, Nate and Karen, and send you the chart that staff has given me of what other jurisdictions do. And I've worked with Lynn Haven, Hume Springs, and a couple others. They've been sending me back recommendations on we'd want to see this, but not this, or we think you need all of these. But I think we have a real moment to finally put some clear enforcement and some clear regulations in place that I'm not sure why we haven't done that in the past.
Okay. Kind of a follow-on question to that while people formulate questions. So DC filed a lawsuit against a dozen or so apartment operators following on a DOJ referral for collusion and rent setting. So as we look at the topics that zoning for housing intended to support, which was increasing supply to decrease price, which we have not seen certainly in the area, is talk to us a little bit about why Alexandria hasn't joined in on that or taken that approach. Because I mean, I think all you need to do is drive through Alexandria and you see the same logos on the side of buildings with exorbitant rents and for lease signs.
Yeah. So I can't speak to why we haven't joined that lawsuit. I don't know that. What I can tell you is this is something that I am deeply passionate about. And what I have tried to work with my colleagues on, as well as our state delegation, is there are authorities we don't have at the local level that we need Richmond to take charge on. And so I've gone down, I've worked on a couple pieces of legislation with Delegate Bennett Parker. All were introduced, some made it out of committee, others that even made it out of both sides of the House and the Senate, they actually ended up getting vetoed. But some of the things that would address what you're talking about, one was related to fees. We have a situation where I think it's probably shouldn't say apartment names, but there is an apartment building in Alexandria where we had a situation where if people's bikes fell over, all of a sudden they were getting $150 fees. Well, then those fees add up and those fees add up and those fees add up. And then now all of a sudden the landlord has a reason to evict you. They flip the unit and then they raise the rent. We have other situations on the West End where, they're trying to do new lease agreements every like 6 months instead of a year, because then the more they can do it, flip it. So the legislation we had in our packet was related to excessive fees, related to maybe caps on percentages of rent increases. Right now we give recommendations, but they're recommendations and nobody follows that because we don't have the ability to enforce that. We had some things related to voluntary payment plans, because what we are seeing in our courts specifically is people will come in and they're getting a case filed against them for owing like $200. The reality is they're working 2 and 3 jobs and they just need another week to get the other piece. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying, I see this. I think this is a problem. I think we need to be doing more. And I think whether it's joining joining some of these other lawsuits, I haven't explored that. But I think one thing we absolutely can be doing is pushing at the state level to give us the authority to push back on these companies that don't care about our residents and don't care about us.
Okay. Yeah, and I mean, I think if you look at the DC lawsuit, it's pretty clear, kind of how they're approaching. So I'd be curious to see what council would take a stand on, trying to limit some of that. Because again, if you walk through Delray, almost every apartment building's got a for lease sign on it, and also managed by the same 6 companies. Does anybody, I can turn it over. I know that we've got a couple of written in questions. Chris, I know you had one from one of the residents that won't be able to be here till the very end. Do you want to go ahead and do that while let other people raise their hands?
Sure, thanks, Nate. So Alyia, I'm Christine Hess. I'm the co-chair of the Delray Land Use Committee. And when zoning for housing came through, I came in front of Planning Commission and City Council and really wanted to bring to the council's attention that we need our neighborhood character preserved. And some of the things that are happening in Delray that are sort of disrupting our historic development pattern are ADUs. And they've kind of gotten out of hand in the scale and where they're located on the property that are now affecting the adjacent neighbors' quality of life. And I'm wondering, planning came out and said this is one of our favorite tools in the toolbox, but it's really ending up that these ADUs are not affordable. They're not being used to provide affordable housing. So my question is, as mayor, would you be able to or commit to possibly making a work plan for planning and zoning to look at what ADUs and the effect they're having on our historical development pattern in Delray and what we can do to sort of rein in what's happening to our neighborhood? And it's sort of a tie into preservation, and I've got a second part of that question, but if you could answer the first part and then we'll come back to my second part.
Yeah. So at the end of our discussion on zoning for housing, one of the motions that I made was requesting that we create a dashboard that looks at every one of the policies in zoning for housing, but also some of the ones like ADUs, co-living, these other things that are a part of our overall housing plan. What I would like to do, and so I guess my answer is not a perfect yes or no to you, because I think this is what I think the dashboard should do. I believe that for every one of these policies, it should tell us a couple things. One, where are the permits being pulled? Where are we actually seeing, the ADU requests? Where are we going to see the bonus density requests? Where are we seeing these things happening in our community? I think it should tell us how much. How often are we seeing these different projects being, are folks coming and proposing these projects to planning and zoning? Third thing it should tell us, I think, is what affordability levels are we getting? I do agree that we need a range of options across our community and we need different options, but I think we also know we need some deeper affordability levels at the people making 40, 50% of AMI. So we need some data to tell us what are we actually seeing show up. And then the next part, and this is what I think is taking us so long for the thing to actually launch, I believe there needs to be some infrastructure metrics, like how are we also understanding the impacts of our development. Why I think this is so important is because A, it helps us plan better, but B, I think it helps us adjust. If there are things we need, if we had a vision for a policy and it was supposed to do X, Y, and Z, and for some reason it's not, or it's doing something completely different than we expected, then we have this tool to tell us, actually, maybe we need to shift or think of a different policy, or we need to go in a different direction to truly get those affordability, those availability goals. That's my long way of saying I would love I want this thing up and running. I have so many opinions on what it'll look like. I would love for it to be right on the website so all of us can pull and see, okay, this is how many things are happening in Delray, or in Delray, we're always seeing the ADUs pulled, but we're not seeing this other policy, and trying to be able to then use that to decide how planning and zoning work plan should shift, but these might need to shift and adjust to actually get the things we say we want as the outcomes we want.
Okay, thank you.
I'm sorry for being late, but I really like that idea, because I remember in the debate last year, there was a lot of that staff had made a lot of predictions about how often these new regulations were going to be used and what the result was going to be. And it'd be really interesting to see if they were right.
Yes.
What were we above what was predicted or below?
That, I mean, I'm a big data geek, so even to see if we were right on our predictions, but like ideally we should be able to see over time too.
And what part of the city it's affecting the most. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
But I would just add that in addition to a dashboard, it would be helpful if you had eyeballs on these ADUs
Okay.
and where they're placed on the property line. Because Chris, I think a couple of them that you were referencing, I mean, they're just right on top of the neighbor's property and they're huge.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so I think
think
I'm the
Jim's
one who
the
has the
one.
eyeballs.
Yes, Jim's the one that I was communicating with. So Jim, you might, explain what you found out today.
Yeah, Councilwoman Gaskins, you may already know about this because I think I sent an email to you about it last night. So I have a project going on behind me. So I live in a duplex unit that backs up to a single family unit. So there's two properties that split the one behind me, and they tore down the existing unit. It was probably built in the 40s. A little single family house, and they're building out to the max.
Okay.
And I get it. I'd probably do the same thing, 2.5 stories, full basement, all of this extra add-ons. It doesn't count on their floor area, so they could do the max. And then they're doing an ADU. And so the ADU is right up against our property line. It's 24 feet wide and 16 feet high. And it's set back 2.5 feet from the property line. I just heard from planning and zoning that at first I thought it was non-compliant because they had measured it being less than 2.5 feet, but now they're saying it's compliant because it's less than 16 feet. So I have an issue with it being compliant, but that's not really what I would like to discuss here. It's just huge. And even if we're set back the 5 feet that I think it should be set back, it's huge. And the thing is 24 feet wide. And in my neighbor, I don't know how it's calculated, but my neighbor's property is almost completely taken up in the back by this thing that's 2.5 feet from his property and 16 feet high, and it goes up from there. There's the wall, and then it goes up the mirror because it's a pitched roof. And the only reason it's not taking up the whole property is because of the side setback that's required, so it bumps into my property a little bit. It seems like we could not have had envisioned something this big when the ADU zoning was passed.
And that's kind of my point, is that this is not part of our historical development pattern to have these huge things in our backyards. If you look at the Delray pattern book, we had small garages in the rear portion of our properties. And this is just totally changing the character. And I think we need to come back and look at how do we start protecting Delray and its character, because these ADUs are just taking over. They're out of scale. They're sometimes bigger than the houses that get torn down, that the McMansions are being built. So not to take up a whole lot of conversation time, but I think that's one of the concerns we have on, at least as land use.
Okay.
So we'll let somebody else have a question.
Well, no, I appreciate you though taking more time and Jim sharing your story, because I think when I first heard the question, which is why I shared the dashboard, I thought it was a question of how much, like how many, and how fast is this development happening? And I think what I'm hearing from both of you is it's also, we really want the council thinking about, how they fit, how big are they, how they're approved. And I will say, Jim, I got your email, and part of the reason why I hadn't responded yet is I didn't know the answer to some of the questions that you pose. And I always respond, but I don't respond to be speedy. I respond to make sure I actually have the right
No, it's okay.
answers and I get you to the right place.
That's
But
okay.
This gives
Okay.
me more insight though on some follow-ups that I need to look into.
Okay.
Thank you.
I think, Alyia, that brings us to, I'm gonna ask another question here. That brings us to one of the concerns that we have heard quite a bit, is there's a general feeling that zoning for housing was rushed through, especially in light of the arena, without getting into why our current mayor had such an aggressive timeline, and then only to announce the arena. It's probably a whole separate conversation that will derail us. But that there was not enough diligence that went in. So for example, in the very last hearing on zoning, second to last, we found out that the elimination of single family only zoning basically allowed for boarding houses as it was written. And that was something that was, we found out literally the hearing before. What with the second phase of zoning for housing currently being assessed, and if I remember correctly, there's a grant that is funding that assessment, and it's going to be considered by the next council. What mechanisms would you advocate for to put more constraints? Sandy, I'll mute you. More constraints that or more of a chance of evaluating the impacts before we just let the floodgates open. Because I think if you walk around Delray, you will see there's one on Monroe Avenue that's currently being built. The ADU is bigger than the house it replaced and all the houses between the Burke and Herbert and DeWitt Avenue. So maybe you can, for the people who felt like it was rushed.
Yeah.
How can we take that lesson learned and some of the impacts that we're seeing and make sure that we don't make that same mistake?
Yeah. So a couple things. One, I know you mentioned the arena. Not once were these ever conversations that I think were thought about together. I can only speak for myself, but that's when I thought about zoning for housing, I had no idea that an arena would be proposed to us later on. For me, my first understanding of the policies that we were looking at through zoning for housing, I actually, as a regular resident, participated in our housing master plan conversations before COVID, and sort of these different work groups and community sessions and Zooms that we started having during COVID around what that policy package might be, where the original 13 were put forth. And this tells you just a little bit about how I approach things. I initially, when we started the conversation and folks were writing in and they were saying, this feels rushed. This feels like I didn't know when to engage. My first thought was like, well, wait, we've been talking about this for a while. Like we've been talking about each of these separately. And then I took a step back and I had some different conversations. So I was like, yeah, well, we've been may have been talking about them, but we haven't been talking about them this way, or we hadn't seen any specific text, or we hadn't seen any proposals. Hold on one second. Honey, I'm finishing this up. Okay, I might have lost my train of thought. So
Specific proposals.
Yes. So then I started thinking about, okay, then we do need to find a different way of talking about this. So some of the things I did to try and, allow for more community engagement, or even work with my colleagues to think about, how I'm the one who put forth the proposal that we have a work session with the Planning Commission so that council was getting the information at the same exact time. Number two, we did not have multiple hearings proposed. So initially we were just going to have one, and I worked with my colleagues to try and give me 1 second. I got to find my husband.
No
Give
problem.
me one quick second.
Recording.
Sorry about that. So yeah, so what I was saying, so then adding the 2 hearings, adding in the portion where we actually, like, you can always talk about whatever you want on Saturdays, but making sure that we're categorizing and having specific sections on zoning for housing. So my goal was, and I know from folks I've talked to on this call, my goal was to try and find some compromises that allowed for more discussion. I know from folks on this call that still felt rushed and it still didn't feel like enough. And so you ask about lessons moving forward. A couple pieces that I think are important One, I think we need to do community engagement differently. Even though we had meetings and conversations, meetings where people are just submitting, their information on a note card, or you don't get a chance to truly tell us, like what we just heard from Jim about what this feels like, how you experience this, how this shows up in our community, that has to change. I also think the way we record what people are saying also has to change. I might get an update that says I met with, staff met with 500 people. There has to be a better way of saying, well, how are we categorizing what those 500 people said? How do we really know the nuances of it's just not for or against, but what are the specific things people are actually talking about and want us to be able to act on? Because that's the only way we can do policy making that's responsive to that. When it comes to a phase 2, there isn't a phase 2 that is being considered right now. Like, the way I think of it is the phase 2 that was talked about, or people kept saying, it's almost like when you're at work and they say, put that on the parking lot, and there's like a bunch of things just thrown there to look at later. Yes, there is a grant that we have. There's no intention of how we spend that grant. There's no specific policies being proposed in that grant. And we have, I think it was almost like 6 years or something that we could use that. I don't think the grant should determine what comes next or when that phase 2 happens or what that looks like. I think we have other things we need to work through. First and foremost is we can't talk about a phase 2 until we actually figure out how to implement and implement well phase 1. And much of that has not even started. I mentioned earlier the dashboard. I think before we propose something else, we need to measure the implementation of what we're doing. Number 3, we have our housing master. Again, another update, which is going to be a 1.5-year process in itself. Before we propose something else, why would we then put the whole community through a year-long process of talking about what that proposal could be? So I think before we think about a phase 2, before we get there, there's a lot of other pieces happening and work that needs to be done well and right and measured and evaluated to inform whatever a future phase could be. So I don't know if that is 3 years away. I don't know if that's 4. I can't give you that. It would be dishonest for me to say that. But what I hope you'll hear is that's the way I'm thinking about this. And that I see very clearly whatever we roll out, these are lessons, not just for any zoning for housing, these lessons around how we engage better should apply to many of the projects we have before our city.
Mhm. Great. Thanks. I think that's a pretty complete answer. Aaron, you had your hand up. I'll go ahead and call on you.
Thanks. Can you hear me? I was originally going to ask about community engagement, but I think you actually covered that pretty well. So I was going to ask about when we're talking about like the additional housing and the growth of Alexandria, one of the questions I want to know is sort of how much is enough? How much is good for the existing citizens versus people who might want to move here, and how does that relate to things like workforce development and economic development goals and housing and infrastructure and that sort of thing?
Yeah, it's a great question. I can't tell you that I have a number of like, this is how much development we need, this is the right amount, or this is what it looks like. What I genuinely believe, though, is that we should, whatever the size we are, we should be able to provide the infrastructure, the resources, and the support to be able to deliver the services people expect and expect it well. What I have observed being on the council and where I want to change or lead differently as mayor is right now we are often project by project. Some of that is a function of the way government operates. We get a project and we look hyper focused on that project. There's a traffic study on that project. There's stormwater management plan on that project. Everything is about that one piece. Where I don't think we have done as well a job and where I think we could do better is pipes connect to pipes, roads connect to roads. All of, a project in a neighborhood is part of a neighborhood. All of these things are connected. And I think there should be ways, our planning and zoning, they have to know where other permits are pulled. They have to know when the next project might be coming. We need that information as well as a council so that then we can think about, okay, one project. This might be three. Those threes all have an impact on our school. Where do each of those three eventually feed into now? And if it's overcrowded already, what could it be if these were each considered? Or what it should be the development contribution from each of these three, recognizing the potential impact that now multiple projects are going to have. So that's something I'd want to see. I think there are ways to do that through mapping. I think there are ways to do that in what we require from our staff reports. And then I think there are ways to do that through working more closely with some of these other, it's not just ACPS, but when we talk about infrastructure, when we talk about, meeting with Parks and Rec and trying to understand what are they seeing in terms of the, number of people trying to get in programs, where are their wait list. I think we need all that information, because the reality is, no matter what the number is, that is what local government is supposed to do. And we need to make sure we're doing that stuff well, or demanding more from a development so that those things are actually being achieved.
Erin, did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
I don't see any more hands up. Does anybody have a question? Sandy, you've got one?
I also sent 2 questions, and I don't know if you covered them.
We have not. So
Okay.
go ahead and ask your first question. And
Okay. Well, I'll ask a different question, and then we can cover those. Thank you, Alyia, for your time tonight. When the arena fiasco that we went through is basically the result of having a small area plan that is no longer adequate or correct. It's no longer meeting. It no longer is accurate. It talks about the metro station being the catalyst to basically employment centers. So we're talking about that that everything has to be, there's too much residential, 82% of the tax base is residential, and we need it to be instead, I'm missing the word I want to use. If it's not residential, it's what? Anyway. Commercial, yes, it started with a C. Just one of those, anyway, so that was what is stated in the small area plan, that we're going to put in, hundreds of thousands of square feet of commercial property. Well, that's no longer accurate. So are we just going to wait for another developer to come along with another big boondoggle type project, or are you interested and are you willing to promote the idea of reopening the small area plan for Potomac Yard and updating it to and getting the community and the city and JGB involved in coming up with, what do we want this place to look like? Because I've heard some crazy stuff from some of the council members running, and we're either going to wind up with another massive project that's not going to fit into or mesh with the adjacent neighborhoods, like the arena did not, or we're going to have a say in the community is going to have a say in what we want to see over there. But it's not going to happen if we're working off of a small area plan that's based solely on the majority of the development coming in being commercial space.
Yeah,
So
I do think there's still value in the small area plan. I think some of the themes that continue to come up during this arena conversation, I did get emails with people talking about innovation, business catalysts, incubators. So I think there's still some really good nuggets we don't want to lose sight of. I think, though, it would be a shame if we wasted these past few months of people voicing their opinions about what they want to see there and do nothing with it. I think we have, I don't even know the exact number, but we have so many emails, so many comments, so many letters. And I think we need to spend some time also going through that, because a lot of people would say, I want this, but not that, or I'm excited about this, but hell no to that. And so I think we need to be collecting that somewhere. I think two important next steps, and I don't know if it's a full like opening of a small area plan, but in this budget, we put in money for an economic development summit. I think that's an opportunity where we all need to get in a room, the residents first and foremost, but our businesses and other stakeholders, to really talk about what from the plan still matters, what from these past months still is important, and then what else have we not yet heard, and how do we create like our proactive set of like, this is what we want to see here. So then instead of waiting for a catalyst to come to us, we can go out and be like, if you want to do business here, this is what we need. These are the things we're looking for, and we find and recruit something that fits for us versus kind of waiting for the next thing. As part of that, the only other thing I would add is I truly believe we cannot just look at Potomac Yard. This goes back to the project by project thing. I think you'll notice it's a thing that pains me a little bit, but we have other nodes in the city. Like we still got to bring Landmark to fruition. We have Eisenhower Valley. We have other places that we're going to be talking about development. And I think some of the principles that we'll see in Potomac Yard also matter for these other sites. So we should about like a citywide strategy where we can always be proactive in recruiting the companies and the entities we want versus waiting for something to come to us.
Sandy, did that answer your question? I muted you because there was some background noise.
I'll unmute and mute quickly. It did, Alyia, but I added to that, and I'm glad that you said the residents will be involved. And as you mentioned, the way that that community engagement happened was pretty poor for us to be able to speak up and be heard. So my concern too is that the Alexandria economic, AEDP is doing this stuff on the back end behind our backs and maybe behind your backs. I don't know, but it seemed like the arena got pretty far along before we even knew about it and before we could even weigh in on it. And I just hope that doesn't happen again for us and for you, for the whole city.
Yeah. I mean, I think what I have learned about this process is there will always be, economic development conversations that we do go into executive decision for. There are certain aspects that are proprietary information, or there are things with, companies might be looking at different places, that will happen. I think that the other thing I learned is I believe that there was no malintent. I think what AEDP was really trying to put forth was a proposal folks could react to. Worrying that, if we just said, okay, an arena's coming, the first questions would be, where was it going to go? What's it going to look like? And I think they were trying to build that. I think the lesson learned, though, is how much do you try and envision, or how much do you try and put together for people to react to, versus how about bringing them in earlier to imagine and co-create some of that things together. And I think those are lessons learned that we need to be thinking about through any future process. But I can tell you from working with our staff, I don't think it came from a place of anyone trying to hide something. Even I can say I sat on that stage because I genuinely believed we were at the beginning of a framework and a discussion. Looking back, I learned a lot that there are many people who saw that presentation and thought, I could never trust you again, or I can never think that we are at the beginning of working together again, because to me, that looked like a finished production. So I think there's a lot of lessons learned for how we do this work moving forward, while still working within, the constraints that we might have with any partner.
Thank you. Do I see Chris? You raise your hand as well.
Well, I just wanted to follow up with the second part of my question, which was, Alyia, we've been discussing historic districts, what we can do to protect Delray. And the Citizens Association just reinvigorated its historical committee to try to get this moving forward. One thing that's affected the development in Delray is, the current zoning regulations, which were changed in 1992, are now being maxed out by developers to try to get everything they can on a lot, which is then taking Del Rey out of the character that we're trying to protect. So short of getting an historic district established, would you consider implementing a work plan to revisit the zoning regulations, the setbacks, the heights, the FAR to sort of bring it back down to where we have and can preserve our neighborhood and sort of put the brakes on this overdevelopment that we've been seeing recently? I'm not sure we'll ever get a historic district established that the city will, you know, uh, let us do. And so is there another option? And that's one way I was thinking of it is, could we sort of revisit the zoning regulations?
Yeah, so I'm actually really excited about the historical committee, and I want to learn from you guys what that path might be. I will tell you on this campaign trail, the town of Potomac has come up a lot. I get this question, and I've heard everything from, I moved to Del Rey because I can kind of do whatever I want, paint my door whatever color, I can do this, and I don't want to see any changes, to others who are like, we want a, architectural review board like you have in Old Town and Parker Gray, to things in the middle, like you talked about revisiting the zoning. I've heard other people mention things like a development delay ordinance where, projects are delayed until you can actually evaluate the history of that project and see, does it fit within, the historic regulations for a particular area. I've heard revamping the pattern book. So all that to say, if I'm going to be true to my beliefs around where I think we can do different with community engagement, I'm not going to tell you I think it should be this, this, and that, but I am willing to come listen to the historical committee, receive whatever, I don't know the process if it goes to the committee and then the citizens associate or how it comes to a recommendation, but I would be really curious what you come up with and to think about, where there's a possibility to move something forward. I think that this doesn't have to be so black and white. I don't think it has to be so tense of character versus development. I do think there are ways these things can work together, and there are still new and great things that are going to come in the community, like some of the new restaurants and places we've seen on the avenue. And I think we want to have those things. We want to encourage those. There are new types of development that may within Del Rey that we also want to encourage, but I think there's still a way to do that through some of the tools I just named or through the tool that you lifted up that still allow us to preserve some of those other things that also make the neighborhood feel so unique and special.
Thank you.
All right, we're coming up on the last 10 minutes. So I'll do a last call for questions. Otherwise, I can close it out. So just give everyone a second. Carter, it's got her hand up. So Carter, I'll call on you.
All right. Thank you, Nate, and thank you, Alyia. I just wanted to follow up a little bit on the ADU situation. I can't remember, frankly, if you were on council when that particular thing was adopted, but I can tell you that it was completely changed at the 11th hour. And that should be a lesson to you and everybody who's sitting up there, because the setbacks were different when we were told about ADUs. It was an 8-foot setback. When the proposal somehow went magically back to staff and it came back, everything was changed. Everything. You had the ability for the owner of the primary residence to not live there anymore, so that there are 2 rentals on a property. We were told at the beginning they wouldn't be Airbnbs, they would all be granny flats. When they came back, oh, well, it's going to be 120 days that they'll be allowed to rent their unit. All of this changed, and there was no time. Nobody could react. It was, here, council, we've tweaked it a little bit in response to comments we've heard. Well, who were those comments from? Developers and people who wanted to max out the whole thing. So I just think when we talk about lessons learned, what we were told is not what the council passed. And we tried to say, look, this is outrageous. This is what's going to happen. Oh, no, other cities have not had this problem. We're not going to have this problem. Well, from what people are saying tonight, we've got it. And so I just caution everyone that sometimes what we thought was going to happen is not what came out of planning again the second time. And we were not able to make any difference in it. And so what you see is what's happening. And I have had a conversation back and forth with the land use guy, Tony Lacola, who I'm sure you know, because I asked a question about the 120-day rule. And here, the 120-day rule applies to ADUs, and we may ask council to remove that requirement at some point in the future. We have no way to track and enforce how many days per year a property is used for short-term rentals. Companies such as Airbnb will not provide us that data. So we are going from now 120 days to probably 365 days because somehow we are unable to track this. And so when you enact something, you need to have guardrails to protect the residents who are going to be affected by this, not just something out of a planning book from another city that didn't have this consequence. So I just wanted to say that tonight because I think it's a big problem with proposals that come to you all in a different form from what came originally. So thanks.
No, I appreciate that, Cart. And so I was not on the council when the ADUs were passed, but this is helpful for me to learn about. Two things that just come to mind that I would share. One, the number one question I probably ask is like, how do we measure things? I don't want to be in a place where we pass things and then we have no way of evaluating ourselves. I've even done this with the community cookouts for the police. I'm like, if somebody tells me one more time that we passed out a flyer, I don't know if somebody threw that flyer in the trash. I don't know what happened next. Like that has to be something. We have to have better ways of measuring our intent and whether or not things work. So I hear you loud and clear on that. Something that I would like to do as mayor is I want to have a monthly meeting. I've said it with civic associations, but I'd want groups like Save Del Rey and others that may not be on our kind of list of civic associations the way we've traditionally thought about them, but African communities together, other groups that are organizing in their community. I want us to have a monthly meeting. And as part of that meeting, it is us actually talking neighborhood by neighborhood, what is happening in different projects. I'd like to actually have us doing quality of life walks with staff. So staff are in these neighborhoods with you and they're seeing, okay, this is what this project is playing out to be. This is how these issues are happening. And then we put out like accountability plans. If we promise you we're going to fix a trash can, I want it posted on the website. So if we don't, like every week you can, screenshot it, tweet about it. You can see that we did not follow up when we were supposed to be following up. But as part of that as well, I'd like us to be getting ahead of things. I don't understand why everybody's finding out just on the docket, like a week before it comes. We should know based on staff work plans, when they're looking at these policies, we should know several months in advance. So if a change like what you're talking about, Carter, is about to happen, like that should already be something we're discussing about. We should already know that staff is looking at potential changes and be able to build in time to workshop that with you or other residents of the community. And I think it'll be us having those monthly conversations, sitting together, talking about it, that I'm hoping information flow, communication, and actual let's put up the text, let's workshop it together. Let's figure out what are we actually trying to create and do that as a team versus so separate as it seems sometimes.
Okay, thanks.
Nate, you're muted.
I was just going to say, we got about 3 minutes left. So unfortunately, that was the last question. So Alyia, I'll turn it over to you to close out. Jim, Sandy, if you've got other questions, you can email them directly to Alyia through us, what have you, and we'll make sure that we get them over to you.
Yeah, well, I will just say first what Nate was going to say. If you send me your questions, you send them to me individually, or if you send them through the group, I will write my response and then you feel free to circulate them. I'll also send my number if anyone wants to call or have follow-up comments for me. I guess I would start with just thanking you. I really enjoyed the conversation. I took lots of notes. You know, I'm on council now, so I hear you loud and clear. There are things that need to be addressed today. I don't need to wait until a future administration. So I'm going to be taking those back and getting some answers for the folks that I owe answers to. Number two, I would just thank you for your patience with me and my children. They are a part of serving this community with me. They have been to several planning meetings and workshops, and yeah, they are learning together. So I thank you for letting them be a part of this as well. And then finally, I would just leave you with, you know, there will be times when we disagree. That's life. There are going to be different things that, you know, we may not always feel the same way about. What I hope that you will take away from this conversation and from my leadership is that I care about this city as much as you do too. This is my home, and my intent is to make it better for all of us. I don't approach anything without doing my research. That research is not just in the books and documents. However, I do believe it's important to read every single thing that comes before us, but I do try and go out and meet with the people who I haven't met with, to speak to those who I haven't spoke with, to hear the sides that I haven't heard. I can tell you during the arena, the Stop the Arena Coalition, they connected me with 3 different economists, and most of the questions that I sent in to staff were because of those conversations with those economists, trying to ask things that I might not have thought about asking because that's not my background. But that's the work I want to do for our community. That's the work I think is important. If you have questions about my platform or any other issues, you can visit my website at aliyahforalexandria.com, and I hope to earn your support. But I hope that you'll also just continue reaching out and sharing your ideas and concerns with me. So thank you for your time.
Thank you for joining us and for the conversation. For everybody who attended, we have Jesse O'Connell, council candidate, tomorrow, and then we have Charlotte Scher on Thursday. Those times are in the invite that you got, so hopefully you'll join us then. Alyia, thank you very much for your time. Everybody else, thank you for your questions, and have a great night.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Good
Alyia.
evening, everyone.